Hi, everyone. I'd like to welcome Mark Littler to the YouTube feed for Vint this week. We're here to talk about the Glenfarclas Pagoda collection that's going live March 30th on the Vint platform. And Mark is a partner of Vint and an expert in the whiskey and a lot of actually like wine as well, a lot of the collectible space. So we're happy to have Mark here to talk about the Pagoda series and really give us a background on the distillery and everything that's special about the series. So welcome, Mark.
Yeah, nice to meet you, Billy. How are you doing? You okay?
Yeah, doing very well. We're excited really to dive in on what makes the Pagoda series so special, what makes Glenfarclas special, and probably learn how to pronounce it properly. I assume I'm not pronouncing Glenfarclas, 100%. But yeah, can you give us a little bit about you and a little bit about the distillery?
Yeah, well, I mean, you're absolutely spot on with your pronunciation of Glenfarclas. That's it's one of the easiest ones. Klein Leash is one of the ones that most people sort of fall over, or Bunnahabhain and stuff like that. But absolutely spot on. But yeah, I'm Mark Littler. So I'm an independent whiskey broker based over here in the UK. We're sort of south of Manchester, which suits us pretty good because we can nip into Scotland quite easily and we can get down to London quite easily. And I think it's all worth noting at this point as well that so much of the whiskey trade is international. It's so small, the trade in the UK comparatively speaking, because we take it for granted that we can just nip to our local supermarket and pick up really amazing whiskies, whereas over in America, over in Asia, the commodity is much scarcer. And then just as a bit of a brief background, I was an auctioneer for 10 years, ran a wine and whiskey sale for the auction house I was working for, and then set up in 2016 as an independent broker and advisor. So rather than just trying to sell my own services in terms of like, if you take a bottle to an auction house, or let's say that you take a watch to an auction house, they're only going to recommend their own services because they're trying to capture the business. So we're like an independent intermediary. We can advise on which route is better for sales or acquisition. So yeah, we're just sort of that friendly middle person to help you out, because it's quite a confusing industry in many ways.
Yeah, and I can say for anybody looking into investing in anything from whiskey bottles to casks, Mark's company produces a lot of really helpful materials. And to his point, they're items that he's working with, but they're very objective and very informative. And in a whiskey market that's pretty opaque, I've found them helpful over the years. So
yeah, and anyone loving NFTs, Gary V is sort of like my mentor in a way. That my whole business model was set up on sort of Gary V's teaching, and sort of you just got to give. And that's why on our YouTube channel and on our blog, we just give out as much information as we can, because there really is sort of like a void of information, especially when we're looking at whiskey in the way that we're talking about it, because we're not talking about tasting notes or drinking whiskey. We're talking about how collectible a bottle of whiskey is. And I think for anyone watching, this is a really fundamental thing to understand about the difference between whiskey and something that's similar, like wine. So wine, the value from wine is derived pretty much from its quality. So if you're watching, like a Robert Parker, the wine advocate, Jancis Robinson, and their reviews, if the wine gets 100 points, like Screaming Eagle did or something, the price jumps accordingly. And then if it's reviewed later and the price is, the quality is falling, then the price falls accordingly. But with whiskey, there's almost zero correlation with quality and the value. So there's some very good instances here to sort of make it sort of real. You've got the Macallan Folio 1 currently trading at auction for about 16,000 pounds per bottle. And it's no age statement whiskey, so it likely contains 3 to 5 year old whiskey, and it was originally released in 2016 for only £250. Now, another very good example of this is the Black Bowmore. Now, this was an original series of bottlings in the early 2000s and 1990s, and the final edition that came out retails on this, or trades on the secondary market for about £11,000. Now, Bowmore teamed up with Aston Martin to represent this whiskey. So they put the exact same whiskey into a different bottle, and it's actually got a piston from an Aston Martin DB5 on it. So it's the same whiskey in two different packagings. And the Aston Martin DB5 one last sold at auction for £81,000. So you're looking at a £70,000 difference in price. for the same whiskey in 2 different containers and packagings. And then if you want to take this to the most extreme end of the spectrum, you've got the Springbank 50-year-old, the original 1970s pear-shaped bottling, sales at auction for about £20,000. Springbank rebottled that in the 1980s, and the record price for that rebottling, now again, this is exactly the same whiskey, but just in a different bottle, is over £250,000. So you've got over £250,000 worth of difference for the same whiskey in a different glass bottle. And that is why whiskey is more akin to other collector's items like watches. So if you think about a Patek or a Rolex or a Richard Mille or whatever, yes, they're very good timekeepers, but when you're sort of watching a video about them, you're not sort of just looking at about how well they keep time. Keeping time is important. They're all certified chronographs, chronometers, but the actual function is detached from the value. So with those sorts of brands of watches, it's also about brand status, and this is very much where whiskey's gone now. So
yeah, no, I've been thinking a lot about watches lately myself personally. So I think the parallel is very similar, because wine needs to be stored in such specific conditions, and maybe you are taking them out and showing people your collection, or you're taking it out at a meal. But whiskey, since it's not really developing in the bottle, and as long as you're not putting it in some really strange situations, you can have it out and actually have it as like a showpiece. So there's something to say for the packaging, and similar with watches, you can bring them out and show people or wear them on a regular basis so people can see them. So I think that's where some of that value is, that vanity value. But I do think you hit on something else that's interesting, though, is even that Springbank whiskey that was 50 years old, it did start at a higher price point because it is old whiskey. So maybe whiskey isn't gauged by the quality of the vintage or the quality of the liquid itself, but there is something to say for the value of older whiskeys that have stayed in barrel for a really long time.
Yeah, exactly. And that's sort of another sort of big contributing factor. But I think, and you just made a very good point there about the wine. If you think about Chateau Lafite, every single year, the Chateau Lafite label, if they've declared a vintage, looks identical. It looks identical going back decades. The only thing that changes is the vintage. Chateau Mouton Rothschild is about the only wine that changes its label each year. But fundamentally, if you look at Chateau Lafite, the container remains the same and the liquid changes, and it's the value of that liquid, and it's not very sort of showy, if that makes sense. The bottle is just a receptacle to move it from the winery to the consumer. Now, with whiskey, there may be people in the industry who disagree with this point of view, or try to hide the fact that packaging matters, but it 100% matters. Look at Macallan's latest release, The Reach. It's in a crystal decanter supported on 3 bronze hands in a big, beautifully bespoke wooden package, wooden box, if that makes sense. Some of the most expensive bottles of whiskey on the market, like the Macallan and Lalique, they're all in Lalique decanters. Does that make the whiskey taste any better? Of course it doesn't. It's what's inside the bottle that counts. And this is where you start looking at the whiskey market, and you start to see the likes of these Glenfarclas bottles, for instance, or you look at the Brewer Triptych, and you look at some of the other modern Macallan releases, like with Peter Blake. The packaging is almost as important, and that's almost what the whole presentation's about. And this is very much what it's like when you sort of pull out your latest Daytona, like your rainbow bezel Daytona. You're not sort of showing your friends about how accurately it's keeping time over there. It's about the newest model because it looks different. And that's very much what it's like with whiskey. It's very much driven by aesthetics and collectors as well. It's that collectible nature. I love my watches, and if you get a Paul Newman Daytona and you show it to someone walking down the street, they'll be like, it's just a Rolex. But then it's like, no, look, it's a Paul Newman. You know what I mean? It really is something. And to have that filling a gap in your collection is what makes it exciting. And it's the same with like the Macallans. You use that folio example again. You've got folios 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's drawing more on about the collecting nature of humans rather than just sort of like the physical taste and profile of the product that's inside it, you see.
Yeah, and I think so. Let's start moving towards Glenfarclas here. But I think to your point about the collecting piece, I think this collection that we're referencing today has a bit of those elements of everything. Because one, the value, at least for the Vint collection, is in that we have the full collection. So somebody's not just going to be pointing to 1 or 2 so they can display them all together. But it is the combination of really unique packaging, really unique whiskey, very old whiskey. It's older than most that are coming out right now. And I think it's really interesting in like combination of all these elements. But let's take one step back and talk about Glenfarclas as a distillery. Can you give us a little bit of background on them and the Grant family?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing to note about the Glenfarclas distillery is that it's pretty unique in terms of it's still a family-owned business. So the distillery dates back all the way to the early part of the 19th century. They were established on a Recleary farm. And the Grant family purchased the farm because they were cattle traders, and where the farm was positioned, it would have made sort of like an ideal sort of stopover step for when they were sort of heading to market. So the distillery was part of the farm buildings, if that makes sense. So they almost came to it by accident. Now, the Glenfarclas distillery's been in the same family now for well over 100 years, and it's that the integrity of the family ownership that makes it quite special. And the reason for that is that they're not necessarily driven by profits, if that makes sense. So if you're owned, like if a distillery is owned by some of the very big, whiskey companies such as Diageo or Pernod Ricard or Remy Cointreau, these are big multi-billion-pound companies that are in some ways, especially with the likes of Diageo, for instance, beholden to shareholders. So they're very much driven by profits and generating profits for the shareholders. Now, a distillery like Glenfarclas, they've always taken the position to sort of just focus on quality, because they don't necessarily have to satisfy shareholders. I'm assuming that the accounts and the coffers at Glenfarclas are quite sufficiently lined, and they can just focus on making a low product, focusing on a smaller production level, but with a very high emphasis on quality, because they're trying to sell quality over quantity. Now, that comes at a consequence really for the secondary market in some ways, because it means that they don't have the marketing, or they don't employ the marketing that the likes of Diageo do, for instance, with they're bringing back Brora and Port Ellen this year. And they don't have that. Although they do have a global reach, it's not as if they've got a multi-billion-pound company with distribution rights all over the world, just trying to get volume sales. They're very much focused on quality. And I think anybody who's doesn't know of Glenfarclas, they are arguably one of the best producers of Speyside whiskey in that Speyside region. If you look to try and like objectify this, so like, okay, right, here's someone telling me it's great. Of course he's going to tell me it's great. Look at Whisky Fun. So Whisky Fun is run by Serge Valentine and Angus McRailed, and that's Whisky Fun is kind of like the Wikipedia of tasting notes for whiskey. We don't have the likes of Jancis Robinson or Robert Parker with whiskey, and the Whisky Fun database is about the most in-depth and concise and sort of like it's constant sort of set of tasting notes that you can get, and they rank Glenfarclas as one of the best producers of whiskey, whereas comparatively you look at Macallan, they're like several classes down beneath Glenfarclas, because obviously if you start focusing on quantity of sales versus quality of product, something has to give. You can't just run your stills and churn it out and churn it over quick. So there's that. And another good comparable there is with Springbank. Springbank is still a very much a family-owned distillery owned by the Mitchells, and this is what I find massively fascinating about Glenfarclas. If you look at the likes of Springbank, so Springbank just did the local barley release of 2022. As soon as it went online, it sold out pretty much overnight. Not even overnight, it was just within hours. If you look at any of the league tables of collectors, Springbank is pretty much like number one or number two. It's one of the most sought after whiskies. And again, their marketing strategy is very similar to that of Glenfarclas in terms of they just focus on quality. They don't necessarily have a huge marketing department or anything like that. And they both very much focus on quality over quantity. Now, for some reason, Springbank is sort of shot way up in these sort of collecting leagues, and I just genuinely think that Glenfarclas is one of these, like it's just hiding in plain sight. The whiskey that they make is incredible. So for instance, you can buy some of their core range of bottles for like 30-40 years old for under £1,000 directly from them. Incredible whiskey, incredible age statements, and for some reason collectors just haven't quite got there. And that's what I find quite fascinating from, let's say, from the investment side of things, because if you're looking at buying a Macallan now, for instance, you're looking at a distillery who's very much at the top of its trajectory. You know, it's never been any higher. Now, people think that Macallan has always been king, but if you go back 10 years or so, Dalmore was the whiskey king. You know, Dalmore held all the world records, not Macallan. And Macallan has only recently taken that crown. So I think if you've got Macallan up here and Dalmore up here, you know, you might have Glenfarclas here and Springbank here. You've got this big transformation that could happen, and you're not seeing a change in the value of the, you know, a change in the product, but you're looking at a change in the perception of the product. And I think that's what's crucial for any sort of like, you know, look at NFTs, for instance, you know, what's their fundamental worth? Almost nothing when you look at what they're made of, but it's that perception of value that's so important. And it's, broadly speaking, it's marketing that drives that perception of value. And this is where I think Glenfarclas is going to really accelerate in the coming years. It might not be overnight, it might not be this year or so, but I think it's just, when you look at it objectively, compared to everyone else in the space side, it really is sort of, it's due sort of like a jump in value.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. I wonder, I mean, it's really hard to explain the Springbank, you know, pricing premium, but you know, there is something to say for Campbelltown having very few distilleries might be easier to kind of stand out, whereas Speyside has a few more distillers. But yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And that, I mean, I've learned a lot more about Glenfarclas as doing this project, but I mean, like with a lot of our, not project, but building this collection, but you know, throughout all of our whiskey research, you know, throughout Vint, Glenfarclas always comes up there, to your point, on all the tasting notes. So I was really excited to be able to get, you know, see a collection, something that was like super premium and something that we could offer for our investors. So this is an exciting opportunity. I guess at this point, can we kind of start making our way down and start talking about the Pagoda series and why I have this building behind me?
Yeah, exactly. So, right, where to start? Because you could start with the really boring historical stuff, which is where I'm going to start because I'm a bit of a nerd on all of this thing. So it's called the Pagoda series. And if you look at your image, you can see a pagoda, you know, to your right, you know, there's a pagoda. Now that pagoda there is on top of the Glenfarclas Visitor Centre, not actually on top of the distillery, but there was one on top of the distillery until around the 1970s. Now, those pagodas are quite common across Scotland. You see them, it's a very sort of archetypal sort of image to see of a distillery, those pagodas. And they sort of come back to an architect called Charles Doig, who was active in the end part of the 19th century. And when you're sort of drying barley, like part of the whiskey making process is to malt the barley. So you get your barley, you start to germinate it, and once the germination's reached a certain point, you need to halt that germination to keep all the sugars and things intact. So the way that they halt it is with heat. So they have almost like a perforated floor, and beneath it you have a heat source, which is traditionally peat or coal or something like that, but it's traditionally peat. And then the smoke would rise up through the floor, through the barley, and then out of the top of the building. Now, surprisingly enough, if you light a smouldering fire beneath a floor of barley, they were quite prone to setting on fire. So, and the reason for this was the ventilation. So on top of on top of the malting floors, you just basically had a normal chimney with like a one single axe, you know, single output of the smoke. Whereas if you look at that pagoda behind you, what it allowed the air to be drawn out of all four sides. So as the smoke was coming through the barley, it would then get drawn up to the top, and then it could disperse in any way. And you'd get a better draw because the wind could come through. So this is your pagoda, the wind could come through it, and it would create a better draw, which made the malting more efficient. So that's the start of the pagoda side of it. Now, this Pagoda series that you're releasing, it's quite unusual that it was, and we'll get back to the pagodas in a second. It's quite unusual that it's an official Glenfarclas release, but all of the funding for the release came from private equity from Asia. So hence we're coming back to these pagodas again, because across Asia, you know, in China, Nepal, Japan, you have pagoda style temples. I mean, I'm sure most of you can sort of be familiar with like the multi-tiered pagodas that you'll see. And that top tier is actually what Charles Doig referenced when he was designing this. Apparently, I don't have any exact sources, but all the sources that I've read say that he was drawn by these Chinese style temples. And then that sort of east and west influence. You've got the western use of a pagoda in Scotland, and then the eastern reference of it. That's what sort of brought the Pagoda series together. And I've actually got one of the bottles here. So this isn't one of the bottles in the set that you're buying. So if you talk about that briefly, you've got a full set of the gold, the silver, the bronze, the ruby, and the sapphire. So it goes bronze, silver, gold, ruby, sapphire. And as each year goes on, or as each release goes on, you get slightly progressive age increments. And then this is the Sapphire, which is the oldest in the series. It's a 63-year-old whiskey, and it's the oldest whiskey that Glenfarclas has ever released. So you kind of get an idea of the quality of it here. You know, does an ostrich leather skin case improve the taste of the whiskey? Of course it doesn't, but it makes it look damn good. Now, when we open this, let me just open this. There you go. So fantastic presentation in here. And then let me just take out one of these. And then we'll get the stopper out. So again, you can see this is the stopper for the bottle, and you can see that pagoda influence there. Now let me just take the bottle out of the box, and then we can have a look at it in a bit more detail.
Cool. And while you're doing that, just for everybody who doesn't know, when the barley's germinating, that process is getting it wet to a point where it basically starts turning some of its carbohydrates into usable sugar, and then that's when the process is halted. So you're putting smoke up through what is moist barley, but sometimes it would dry quickly, and then that would start the fire. So it's not just, you know, smoke under dry barley or dry germinated barley. So just clarifying that.
Yeah, good point. And then so yeah, like here's the bottle, and then if we put the stopper on top for full effect, I don't know if you can sort of see it easily with me behind it or not. So that's any better. But it's it's sensational presentation, and I think, you know, you can't deny that this bottle was the design of the bottle is partly driven to make it look like an expensive bottle of whiskey. And I think, you know, does a diamond bezel increase the timekeeping potential of a Patek or a Rolex or a Richard Mille? Of course it doesn't, you know. And it's the same with all of this. It's these bottles are designed to attract a certain element of the market. And, you know, if you're spending, you know, 20, 30 grand on a bottle of whiskey or 50 grand on a watch, you want it to look expensive. And oddly enough, this is what these bottles do perfectly. So you can see the shape of the decanter. This is made by the Glencairn company up in Scotland, and they were commissioned to do all of the design work and production of this. But obviously you can see it's a 30% lead crystal decanter, so it's a really, really high quality decanter. And if I don't know if you've shared the video about the little promo video, but you can't really see it here, but 63 here. So this is a 63-year-old whiskey. You can see it's set with individual sapphires. So that date, you know, the age statement is set with sapphires set in sterling silver. You know, the Glenfarclas logo here is actually made of sterling silver and fully hallmarked. So the UK hallmarking system is peculiar to the UK. You know, you have, if you make something of sterling silver over there, you stamp it 925 and that's fine. But in the UK, it's the oldest form of consumer protection in the world, actually, hallmarks. But these, you know, every single piece of silver on here is fully hallmarked. And then you see, obviously you see the Chinese influence on the side. Again, you've got two temple dogs or guardian lions, which again, in Chinese culture is a symbol of wealth and the elite. These would sort of go outside your residence, and there were big marble carvings typically. So it was like a display of wealth. So everything about this bottle, from the quality of the whiskey inside it, so it's the world's oldest Glenfarclas release that's ever come to the market. You know, it's a 63-year-old distilled in 1953, to the quality of the craftsmanship is just second to none. And there are, again, you'll be able to see on your website the different styles of presentation. So the ruby, which is slightly younger than the sapphire, it comes in a beautiful lacquer presentation case, and they just really are outstanding bottles. And I think it's important to note that the set that you've got, that is actually you know, every bottle, the bronze, the silver, the gold, the ruby, and the sapphire, have the same limited edition number. So it's one of a very small number of sets in existence in the world. So I don't believe there's any more full sets that you can go out and buy that are consecutively numbered. I believe yours is one of the final ones that has ever been sort of purchased, really.
Oh, interesting. That's a really good point. I hadn't actually noted that in our thesis, so I'm happy you brought that up here for our community to, yeah, you can zoom in there to our community to get a sense of. Can you talk a little bit more about like how this collection is kind of divvied up into two? How they kind of have the metal three, I guess, triumvirate, if you want to call them that, and then the two, the ruby and the sapphire, and how they kind of flow into each other and play together?
Yeah, so the first three series, the first three bottles of the series, the bronze, the silver, and the gold, they were released back in 2016, and they've obviously got bronze mounts, silver colored mounts, and gold colored mounts to sort of differentiate them. And as you go up, the age statements also increase. But they were sort of like the touchstone of this whole project, I believe. You know, after the success of those gold, silver, and bronzes, in 2020, the same company who had commissioned the gold, the silver, and the bronze released the ruby and the sapphire. And these were to sort of to represent the fact that it's got the world's oldest Glenfarclas in there, is to sort of, you know, they felt like they had to do it justice, if that makes sense. And I think that's exactly what these bottlings do. There's not many bottles of whiskey that you can display that has this level of impact. So let me just see, just give me 1 second. So here's another bottle that we can bring up here. Let me just move this Pagoda bottle out of the way. So this is a Macallan Fine and Rare 1971. Now this is a £20,000 bottle of whiskey. So it's, you know, you're spending a lot of money on this whiskey, and this is a completely genuine, completely bona fide bottle of Macallan. So you can sort of see it here. Now, I don't know if you can sort of tell on the picture, but that front label isn't quite straight. You know, this one's sort of slightly off center. It's a bit ski-whiffed. And also the presentation of this bottle, yes, it's nice. It's 30-year-old Macallan, but does it look like you've just spent £20,000? Well, you can kind of accelerate that to infinity, because you've got the 1926 60-year-old bottling of Macallan that holds the world record for the most expensive bottle of whiskey ever sold, £1.5 million. It's the same series as this. It's the same presentation as this. It's the same oak wooden box. Let me just get the box up there for you. So this oak box is nice, but if you have that on your shelf, does it look like you've just spent £20,000 on a bottle of whiskey? It doesn't. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. I don't think you just need to be driven by packaging, but to sort of dismiss the fact that there's a certain portion of the market that likes displays of wealth is naive, because, you know, why do you get diamond dial or rainbow bezel Daytonas? You know, it doesn't add anything to the fundamental aspect of that watch in terms of its timekeeping. It's just for status. And that's where these pagodas come into their own, really, because, you know, it's the world's oldest Glenfarclas whiskey ever produced. The whiskey in there is absolutely sensational. They spent a lot of time selecting the whiskey from several different casks to try and pick which was the best cask, the most superlative cask out of them all. And they've recognized that presentation is important with this, and to have a full set would look sensational on display. So if you imagine if you had 5 bottles of Macallan Fine and Rare on display, you're essentially going to get 5 different boxes that look exactly like this. There's no differentiation. The only differentiation would be the dating on here, you see. So I think it's, when you look at the whiskey market without trying to be too precious about the product, if that makes sense, you realize what an amazing series this Pagoda series is, because I can't think of another series of bottles that has the attention to detail as the Pagoda series do. So, you know, it's like watch blogs or watch auction catalogs, literally just running chronometer tests on all the watches and rating them by how accurate they are. Like, who cares? You know, my Garmin here is more accurate than all of them. It's not about that, you know. It has to have that integrity of product, which it does. You know, it's the world's oldest Glenfarclas, fantastic whiskey, but it also combines that in a way that's aesthetic, and it makes it appealing to non-whiskey drinkers. You know, it doesn't just look like a normal bottle of whiskey, and I think that's important, really.
Yeah, and building on your point of the attention to detail. So when you were talking about the selection of these bottles, they were selected by George Grant, who's sixth generation Glenfarclas, and then Stephen Notman, who is a keeper of the Quaish. Again, Quaish, correct my pronunciation. But what I found interesting about that is not only is he he's Scottish and he's a whiskey expert, he's, you know, been on rating panels, he's been, you know, kind of a whiskey expert known very well in Asia. So it's a name that not only, you know, has reputation and respect in Scotland, but also would resonate with the consumers in Asia as well. So it's kind of interesting they thought of it at every step of the way along this process.
Exactly. And I think it's important to state as well, although I'm waxing lyrical about the packaging, you know, this project started from the ground up with the whiskey, if that makes sense. You know, the whole project started working with the grants, working with experts, you know, with just starting with the whiskey, and then sort of building up around that is how you get to, you know, how you get to that sort of final product, really. And it's, you know, I specifically don't talk about whiskey notes in anything that I do. You know what I mean? We're very much focused on the how collectible and the historical side of these things, rather than just how it tastes. Because believe it or not, there's no one else in the industry taking this approach. You know, you look at YouTube, 99% of YouTube channels are people tasting whiskey. And to me, you know, we released a couple of weeks ago the history of the Glenfarclas distillery. You know, about 2 months ago, we released a history of the Macallan distillery. And it's like, on the whole of YouTube, my history of Macallan is the only one that's on there. And it's like, well, come on, how many histories of Submariners or Rolexes or Lafite and different chateaus are there? You know, it's as much as far as the whiskey industry has evolved in the last, say, 7 years. I would say 2015 is when it changed from being a drink to a status symbol. It still lags way behind in many, many different ways. You know, there's still a whole amount of scope for growth there, especially when you consider that America is only really just starting to warm up to the collecting of premium single malt whiskey. You know, you're a very big consumer of Scotch whiskey. I'd argue the majority of it's blended, but in terms of the collectible nature of it, we're almost just in its infancy. I think we're going to be surprised at how much potential is left in this industry, really, as we sort of move on. You know, again, you keep coming back to Macallan. They've just you know, combined, just entered into a partnership with Bentley. So, you know, two leading luxury brand manufacturers joining together. Bowmore and Aston Martin have done the same. You know, Lalique actually brought the Glenturret distillery. And I think we're only at the start of this process, really, especially if anyone watching this has actually been up to the distilleries. Like, you go to the Glenfarclas distillery and you're met by the friendliest, most amazing group of people there. The tour's absolutely fantastic. You can go around, or you go into the still house, you go into the warehouses, it's fully hands-on. Likewise, you go to Macallan, you're treated like family almost. You know, they absolutely love the fact that you're visiting their distillery and their production facility. And, you know, if you compare that to the likes of, let's go back to the watch analogy again, you go to Switzerland to try and visit Rolex, and unless you're buying a very high-end timepiece, you're not really going to be welcomed with open arms. Whereas you can spend £7, go on a tour of Glenfarclas and get a few drams at the end of it. You can spend it's slightly more, I think it's about £25 at Macallan, and the same. But it's like, it's just that it's such a friendly, welcoming community, the whiskey community. And it's just fascinating how much growth there is there. And you know, one of the reasons that I say that, if anyone who's thinking about researching Scotch whiskey to collect, there's almost no reference books that talk about whiskey on a collecting level. Emmanuel Dron is the only person I know who's written a very comprehensive book, and I'll just get it to show you. Now ours is very well used, so our covers come off, but this is like, you can see, good couple of inches thick, and it contains pretty much life-size reproductions of all the bottles. But this is a 400, 500 pounds book to purchase, you know, whereas if you wanted a history of all the products that, say, Chateau Lafite has produced, there's loads of history books on Chateau Lafite. Same with watches. There's so many amazing, we've probably got a few here, you know. Yeah, take this for instance, you know, vintage Rolex sports watches. You can pick this up for under £100, and it's literally the Bible of Rolex watches. But we don't have that mass market media yet for whiskey. So the barriers to entry, I would argue, still remain quite high in terms of education. And that's where my company takes the approach of sort of like, we try and make it more accessible for people by giving them the histories of these things, rather than just sort of saying, here's something, come and buy it, because I think that's fundamentally wrong, really.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And we're seeing the same thing in the wine market as it's starting to broaden. It's going beyond Bordeaux. So I think when people think whiskey, maybe, you know, it has had astronomical growth, but there are certain brands that everybody knows, and that's why they're going there now. But starting to gain this appreciation and this more education, it's definitely disseminating out. We're seeing a lot of this, like our last rosé collection. We were making the point that champagne sales were great last year, and the Americans are driving it. It's because Americans are starting to understand there's more than just the, you know, baseline champagne that they're buying here. Now they're understanding that more. There's other categories like Germany and elsewhere where Americans are driving this growth, but it's not because of the quality or anything's changed. It's because the information is starting to get out, and there's appreciation going beyond Europe now, and then beyond Asia as well. So it's interesting as this education continues. I think things like this collection and other collectibles that require maybe that one level of digging more that the experts know and everybody else is kept to themselves kind of appreciate is now going to be a little more broadly acknowledged and respected. So
yeah,
I think that's a great point.
If you want to look at like a material example of that, and I think there is this sort of dichotomy in the whiskey collecting world as well. So if you use Macallan again as an example, look at the Macallan Folio 1, released in 2016, no age statement, edition of about 2,000 bottles, £250, and it's now worth sort of £15,000 on the secondary market. Now, so is that sort of growth sustainable? Well, no. You then start looking at it comparatively speaking. Okay, then what else can I buy from Macallan? Well, you could buy a 1957 25-year-old anniversary malt for about £5,000. So hang on a minute. So you're looking at no age statement whiskey versus 25-year-old whiskey, no vintage statement versus one that was, you know, distilled in 1957, and then one's fundamentally scarcer. You know, the 1957 25-year-old, it's appeared less than 100 times at auction in the last 20 years. Yet the Folio 1 has been sold nearly 1,000 times since it was released. So you've got a fundamental disassociation with the basis of the value of the product, if that makes sense. So while Folio 1 might appeal to some collectors because you're just literally looking at the growth, and you can't argue with the data, it's on a huge growth trajectory. You start looking at the fundamental values of that product, and that's where it completely falls down and you could have a big crash. So for instance, if you look at this Sapphire again, the RRP on that bottle, duty and VAT paid, it's about £27,000. Wow, that's a lot of money. But hang on a minute. People are spending £15,000 plus auction fees, so call it £18,000 for a no age statement whiskey versus £28,000 for the world's oldest ever released product. You know, there's a lot of the market needs to sort itself out, but this will sort of change over time, you know, as people start to realize. I mean, we had a big run on Bordeaux in the mid 2000s as all the Asian collectors tried to come in and collect their verticals of Bordeaux, and then they moved on to Burgundy. And you know, if you look at the price of DRC when Lafite was at its high, it was just shamefully low. You know, yes, DRC has always been expensive, but if you look at the transformation in value of it in the last 5 years or so, it's phenomenal, really.
On that note, we're also seeing kind of as the wine market broadens, we're also seeing a return to that appreciation for the top tiers as well. Though that's kind of interesting. Like in Bordeaux, that immense growth trickled down to everywhere, and now, you know, Bordeaux used to make up 90+% of the secondary wine market. Then it went down to 60, and now it's, you know, closer to between 30 and 40. And we're seeing the percentage of that Bordeaux sold now going back more to the first gross and that upper tier. So it's kind of interesting that, again, it's an education side of things. What necessarily is making things better? Does the name Bordeaux itself mean something? Does it have to do with these producers and these vintages? So no, I think those are all great points. I was just gonna say one more thing before we keep going on the kind of a similar vein is let's talk about what the specific, I know we touched on them, the different bottles, but I would love to like kind of explain what each bottle is kind of all the way down the series from bronze through sapphire, because I just realized we hadn't really touched on that yet, and I want to make sure we don't forget now that we're 46 minutes in.
Yeah, and let me double check, because I don't want to get this wrong, because it's that you've got 5 lots of different dates, and I want to make sure that I get all of this right. So the bronze edition is a 1971 43-year-old, and it was a limited edition of 100 bottles. Now the silver release was a 1967 48-year-old, again limited to 100 bottles. And then you've got the gold, which was a 1956 59-year-old, which again was limited to 100 bottles. So you've got, so the bronze is a 43-year-old, the silver is a 48-year-old, and the gold is a 59-year-old. Then you move to the ruby, and that's a 1954 62-year-old, and that was an edition of 180. And then you've got the sapphire, which was a 1953 63-year-old. So you're working all the way up, which are massive age statements, really, from a 43-year-old as the entry edition, shall we say, all the way up to 63-year-old. So it's absolutely vast, the age range in these, and I think that's what's quite fascinating. And yes, Scotch whiskey is getting quite expensive, but when you think that sapphire whiskey has taken 63 years to mature, you had to have the foresight in 1953 to lay down a cask and leave it and leave it and leave it. It's unlike almost any other product, because even with wine, there's a lot of things out of your control in terms of the terroir and also the weather of a particular year. But it only takes 2 years between, harvesting and en primeur release sort of thing, until it's sort of bottled. So it's sort of a smaller time frame, whereas that's taken 63 years in the making. It's absolutely phenomenal, really. And that's what's almost the throttle of growth for whiskey brands, is the fact that if you don't have those old reserves, you can't make these super premium releases. Now, the Macallan releasing the 82-year-old Reach, for instance, is that going to make them a lot of money? It'll make them millions, but not in the scheme of things. But what those very high age statement, very ultra prestigious releases do is they increase the perceived value of the brand, which drives more sales of the core range product, like the 18-year-olds, for instance, which are just here. They're only about £300 on release. So it's that, and it's the same with, like, look at sort of like Max Boozer and Friends or Richard Mille. Does a tourbillon? Does everybody afford one? Of course you can't, but you can have that brand aspiration. You might only have the entry level product, but you're still associated with that very high product. And that's the fundamental problem with new distilleries in Scotland. There's a lot of hype about the performance of how these new distilleries are going to do, but if they don't have this, if you don't have that depth of product, you're only going to be able to sell young, cheap whiskey. A distillery set up 25 years ago is still going to have to wait 40 odd years before they can release a 60-year-old release, if they've had the foresight to keep a cask that long and not tap into it for cash flow, and if that cask has survived in good health. Because obviously you can't just mature endlessly and hope that the maturation continues well, because your ABV and your angel share can render the product no longer whiskey. So there's so many factors that go into making a product like that incredibly rare, and it's more than just sort of saying let's bottle it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I was just going to emphasize that point. As Vint, we've had a cask collection. I personally invest in casks, and it's like the fact that a barrel was able to mature for that long without going below that 40% threshold of being considered Scotch whiskey is just, to me, amazing in itself. Even when you're pushing 30 years, you're like, wow, this is a special cask, and then it keeps going. So I just want to emphasize everybody that not every barrel can make it that long. And these are like truly special barrels. So casks.
Yeah, and especially when you look at your market for whiskey in the US, your temperatures and humidities don't allow such long-term maturation. So in Kentucky, for instance, the climate there, you've got when you're maturing whiskey, you're essentially maturing pretty much two compounds, ethanol and water. And depending on the humidity and the temperature, you'll either evaporate more ethanol or you'll evaporate more water. If you evaporate more water than ethanol, you will drive the ABV high. And that's why in America, you have to bottle, I've forgotten the exact ABV, but it can't exceed a certain ABV. And if you kept maturing that cask for 10, 20, 30 years or so, you would end up with basically just pure alcohol left in there. It wouldn't be what we would know as whiskey. So Scotland is unique in its climate for being not just boringly average. It never gets hot in summer. Yes, certain parts of it get cold in winter, but I think Speyside's actually one of the mildest parts of Scotland because it's so well protected. So that boringness of its climate, you don't have any big peaks in the summer or troughs in the winter like you do in Kentucky and places, means that whiskey can just sort of carry on slumbering for such long periods of time. The only other country comparable to that is Japan. Certain parts of Japan have got a similar climate to Scotland, which is just mediocre and great for long-term maturation of whiskey.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. The only other thing I think could be at all comparable in my mind is like Madeira as well. They're not making whiskey, obviously, but similar kind of consistency over a period of time, allowing things to age well in barrel.
Yeah.
Well, that's a really great point. Well, I think we've covered a lot of everything I want to talk about. I think we gave you were able to offer a lot of insight that we haven't included in our one sheet. So this is a great addition to the materials we've already shared with everyone. Do you have any parting notes here on how you want to end it with the Pagoda series?
No, I think the parting notes would be, if you look at any product, you've just got to look at the fundamentals of it, of what you're basing your valuation on. And I think the Pagoda series especially combines, it brings everything together perfectly, in my opinion. It's got superb whiskey, very carefully selected by incredibly talented noses. It's the world's oldest Glenfarclas whiskey that's ever been released. Your set is one of a very, very small, limited, numbered sets that exist in the world. And again, you look at the presentation of it and it's second to none. You look at the likes of Macallan and Lalique. Yes, it's well presented, but I don't think it's anywhere near a patch on this. The workmanship and the craftsmanship that's gone into this series is just phenomenal. So when you put all of that together in a package, you can see why it's incredibly desirable, because it appeals on both levels. It appeals on the instant, wow, that's incredible, both in terms of its looks and the age statements, but it also works on a much deeper level in terms of the Glenfarclas distilling history, the Glenfarclas quality of product, the quality of whiskey that's in these bottles. It all comes together. There isn't, personally, I don't think there's an angle that you could attack it for. And one thing that we've not really mentioned on this is that how scarce they are. You look at the secondary market, there's never been any sales of 70 CL bottles on the secondary market. There's never been any full sets available anywhere. This is the first time that a full set's been available. And especially what I love about Vint is how democratic this process is of investing. RRP on a full set, £115,000. I don't know what your share price is, but it means that you can be part of it and actually partake in that ownership, which is what I find really fascinating about this fractionalization of assets that we're growing into now.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Our share price is $43 US. So you can own a share of this, which, to your point, is not very common at all. And like a single one of these would be difficult, not only, I know they're expensive, but it's even also difficult to find for the most part, and to ensure, proper provenance and where it all came from. It's very intense. So, well, thank you for that. Yeah.
if anybody wants to go and see a full set, so if anybody's up in Scotland, there's the Craig Ellecky Hotel just near. It's in the middle of Speyside. It's about 3 miles from Glenfarclas, about 2 miles from Macallan, and they've actually got a full set of the Pagoda series on display. So if you wanted to go to Scotland and view these in person, then you can go and see them. There.
Oh, that's a great point, because ours are going to remain in a bonded warehouse until we decide to sell them down the line. So that's actually a great point. Cool. Well, I'd have to do that myself. Aside from seeing ours, I would love to see them outside of a warehouse setting where they're just put on a table. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Mark. This has been great. Yeah, we are excited to continue to partner with you down the line, and look forward to definitely doing more of these educational series down the line.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me on.